So good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Colonel Dave Gray. I'm the director here at the Center for Leadership and Ethics. I'd like to welcome you to our Courageous Leader Series. The Courageous Leader Series brings a variety of folks to Post to talk to staff, faculty, cadets, outside folks, to share their ideas about leadership, ethics, character, and that might be in or out of combat. And so this year, our series has really focused on the intelligence and special operations world, and this is our second in the series of 3 speaker events. Our next one will be on Monday, April 21st at 7:45 here in Gillis, and it'll feature Miss Tracy Walder, who is a former CIA operative, FBI agent, and the author of The Unexpected Spy. So I cordially invite you to return here in about a month. But tonight, we have a special guest here tonight, and I'm very pleased and honored to introduce Colonel Andrew Milburn, who is a U.S. Marine colonel, retired. Andrew was born in Hong Kong and grew up in the United Kingdom, where he attended St. Paul's School and University College London. After graduating from law school, lawyer, oh, I didn't know that, a lawyer, he enlisted in the Marine Corps as an infantryman. After 2 years as an enlisted Marine, he was commissioned as a second lieutenant via the enlisted commissioning program and embarked on his career as a Marine officer. He's commanded Marines in combat in every grade. While serving as commanding officer of the Marine Corps Special Operations Regiment, he was selected as the first MARSOC commander to lead a multinational task force, specifically what we call a CJ-SOTF, Combined Joint Special Operations Task Force, given the mission of defeating ISIS in Iraq. He retired in 2019 as Chief of Staff of the Special Operations Command, Special Operations Command, Central Command, the headquarters responsible for conducting all U.S. special operations throughout the Middle East. Since his retirement, Andy has been a prolific author on topics such as leadership, ethics, and cultural change for a number of publications, including The Atlantic, USA Today, and War on the Rocks. And he has his written memoir, When the Tempest Gathers, From Mogadishu to the Fight Against ISIS, a Marine Special Operations Commander at War. So he's going to stick around and sign a few books if you have them available after this. So ladies and gentlemen, please give a good, warm welcome to Colonel Retired Andy Milburn.
Hey, thanks very much. I appreciate it. All right, the obligatory sound check. Can you hear me okay? We're going to start. I always feel like a karaoke star up here without the talent. Good? On sound? Everyone hear me? Okay, perfect. All right, everyone, good evening. It's again, no one paid me to say this. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I'll tell you why. I want to thank Colonels Looney and Homiak, not only for their tolerance of me during our mutual active duty careers, but also for inviting me here today. And I'll tell you why it is a thrill for me to be here. Number one, okay, this is no exaggeration, VMI has a mafiosi-type hold within the Marine Corps. I mean that in a positive way. If you're going to think VMI, mafiosi, that was a bad analogy, I'm sorry. But in a good way, very strong bond. I think I'm fond of saying, and I know it's true because we added it up one time when we had too much time on our hands. There are more VMI-educated generals in the Marine Corps than Naval Academy educated generals. Travis, I'm not going to put you on the spot. Would you say that's likely? It is very likely, yeah, which is, I mean, which is very impressive. Plus, my mother went to Sweetbriar College, close to here. You may have guessed from my accent that I did not grow up in this country, but my mom did. And so she was warned at an early age about VMI cadets. So that would pass that on to me. Anyway, great pleasure to be here. Because I have severe ADHD, and because I have sat in seats just like yours, I will tell you what lies ahead, all right? I'm going to talk for 45 minutes, maybe 40, 45. We'll see how it goes, all right? Timing myself. And then open the floor for questions. This is not intended to be kind of a Colonel Blimp, there I was, you know, let me tell you about my career. Think of it more as things that I wish I had known. I say things I wish I'd known when I was a second lieutenant, or at least someone had alerted me to. I doubt it would have changed my trajectory. I was very lucky. I was talking to Colonel Looney earlier today. Without exaggeration, I could have been relieved, relieved and not in a good way, in a bad way, at every stage of my career, probably every rank. That is not an exaggeration. I was simply, like many of us, fortunate enough to have seniors who are fairly tolerant of my eccentricities and my mistakes. In fairness to me, because that's the most important thing, I'd like to think that I've learned along the way. And just during dinner, I was speaking to a handful of you Marine options, and I commented that, you know, emotional intelligence, the ability to assess yourself, the ability to reflect, is what, in the end, separates a guy who who becomes a terrific leader from the guy who kind of who blocks himself out. And it doesn't matter how long he stays in, he is never going to really learn about leadership. And the other thing I want to say too, and it's something that I mentioned earlier, leadership's a hard skill, guys. We tend to talk about things like, I don't know, shooting or land navigation, weapon skills, whatever it may be, as being hard skills. But those things, although they're perishable, you can teach anyone those things, right? You can teach anyone to be a good shot. But you can't teach everyone to be a good leader. And that didn't occur to me until after I retired, and I happened to be talking to a friend of mine who works at Amazon. And he said, he was talking about the fact that they focus on veterans when they recruit. And he said, it's not every veteran, but for the most part, they have skills that we just cannot teach the workforce today. All right, so you are on the right trajectory. All of you going into the military, just please bear in mind, and I'm going to come back to this, that it's kind of that your ability, though, to reflect, to learn, not to reflect yourself into self-paralysis, because we all make dreadful mistakes, embarrassing mistakes. But nevertheless, that ability, at least to take part of every day, to think, reflect, is really going to stand you in good stead. Certainly in the Marine Corps, we are zealots about physical fitness to an extent. And we say, hey, you always have time to PT, right? Find 45 minutes, find 15 minutes, it's keeping yourself in shape. Same thing mentally, all right? If you guys aren't doing that every day, if you're not getting in the habit now, you certainly need to, because that is really what's going to cut you apart. And everything else, other things that we devote our time to, General Dunford will tell you. And he gave a really good talk to officers at TBS when I was there one time. And he said, look, from this point forward, it doesn't matter how good a shot you are, as long as you qualify. Officers, we expect people to qualify expert or whatever. It doesn't matter, as long as you get a first-class PFT. No one cares. What you get judged on from this time going forward are your leadership skills. And unless you're getting better, you're getting worse in that regard. So I remember very distinctly him saying that. Those of you who've heard of General Dunford, I know a few of us have worked with him. There's no doubt about that man's leadership credentials. And he's 100% right. I haven't always done that along the way. I try and do it now. And please, bear that in mind. If you're PTing, as you should, every day for your mental health, you should also be taking time and reflection, taking notes, thinking about things you have or haven't, how you did, I could have done that better. Observing other people, too. You're going to see examples out there, sadly, of both good and bad leadership. And I don't know, how my peers in here, Dave or Pat or Travis, feel, but I've learned probably more from bad leaders I've had than from good leaders. So all is not lost if you find yourself in that predicament. All right, we're going to get on to leadership in a moment, but I want to start by talking about current events, just a few things to think about. And I'm not going to troll through, a lot of the themes depressing themes that we're seeing in the press in Ukraine. But I do want to pick up on a couple of things because I think these are kind of signposts, they're indicators. Don't worry, Travis, I'm not going to say nature of the war has changed, but how war has evolved, right? How the tools of warfare evolved. Okay, number one, all right? Some of you may have read or have been following on YouTube or TikTok, which is where my kids saw this, believe it or not, the success that Ukrainian drones are having against the Russians, particularly the TB2, which is a Turkish mass-produced expendable drone. And those of you who are maybe sad individuals and have been following drones for some time, and I'm one of those sad individuals because I find it quite frightening. There's been an evolution in drones such as the TB2 since 2015. The Houthis are using them, not the TB2, but expendable drones. And here's the most scary thing about them, all right? They are now, used in mass. They can penetrate probably any IAD system that either Western powers or the Russians can set up in Nagorno-Karabakh. Although the Armenians were not necessarily top-notch fighters, nevertheless they had a sophisticated IAD system, and Turkish drones went through that thing like knife through butter. What does that mean for us in the U.S.? It means that we need to start thinking about protection from the air. Actually, we've been thinking about that since 2015, but it's becoming more and more acute of a problem, and it's just a matter of time before we find ourselves under the same type of devastating attack. Probably in the Middle East, I would guess, is where it's going to happen. So from the point of view of our adversaries, you see that, I wouldn't call it a revolution in warfare because, to Colonel Homiak's point, we're still talking about the same fundamentals, right? We're still talking about the kill chain from observing, sensing, making the decision to strike and striking, right? We do the same with mortars and artillery. The point is now that the kill chain has been democratized. By that I mean anyone can afford to have a pretty sophisticated kill chain at long range, to include our adversaries. And they are working hard to develop it, both at a great power competition level with the Chinese, lesser extent the Russians, and in the Middle East with Iranian proxies. That is something that all of you who are going, and by the way, how many of you are going to be commissioned? Okay, good, yeah. So all of you are going to have to contend with this, right? Okay, that's lesson number, that's kind of interesting point number one from the Ukraine war. Number two, in the Daily Telegraph, British Daily Telegraph today, there are open source reports about plummeting Russian morale. And I'm trying to find this, how, and there's intercepts, right? Radio intercepts. So I'm thinking maybe they got this from maybe the UK or the US governments. But no, it came from a British private company, right? That specializes in signals intelligence and picking up widespread. This isn't just anecdotal. Telegraph is pretty serious paper. But not just here and there, it's across the board indications that Russian morale is in a really, really bad state. And you kind of, again, I don't have any special insights from no longer wearing uniform, but you kind of pull it all together, right? There's a Russian convoy that has he's approaching Kiev, but just at a glacially slow pace. And everyone's wondering, what the hell is slowing it down? And it may be, aside from logistics, it appears, too, that they're having discipline and morale problems. Why do I mention that? Because the use of the information, I don't want to call it information domain. I know that's not the correct term. Operations in the information environment. We pay lip service to it. We're not very good at it yet in the US military, but that is everything. It was something that we focused on heavily in the counter-ISIS campaign, picking up signals intelligence reports about the divisions within the Islamic State ranks between foreign fighters and domestic fighters. And it is something that Russia's enemies should be picking up and exploiting right now. We are scratching the surface in the US military. We really are. Now imagine, and I'll explain why. And don't worry, I'm going to get back to leadership, guys. But this is conversation about modern war, which I think is interesting. It's going to be your profession. It was my profession. It's still my interest. But think about this. So, as we're approaching, and this is not a criticism of any policy at all. I'm just saying that maybe this is an indication of how lockstep we are in our thinking. By we, I mean US. So, when we're thinking through flexible deterrent or other force deterrent options to try and stop the Russians coming in, everything seemed as though it was going to be run too much risk of escalation, so we resort to economic sanctions, right? But there's probably going to be a time, one hopes, where we can be doing other things, right? Still with a risk of escalation, but we may decide, hey, these are things, this is a risk we're willing to take, and we can take debilitating action without firing a shot. For instance, use of cyber at the tactical level. Okay, not such a crazy thought. How many of you are going into cyber here? Okay, one. All right, that was unfair of me to pick you out. I know I met, okay. But think about it, all right? Excellent, okay, see you back there too. Russian, I have, because I'm a sad individual, did look a little bit, by the way, I was never a lawyer. I went to law school, never practiced. I knew I'd be a crappy lawyer. And the only legacy that it has had is the fact that I've been given every investigation that comes down the pike when I was an officer in an infantry battalion. But anyway, my point is this, okay? When you look at, it's very interesting when you look at what you can use cyber for or not, the legal norms for use of cyber have not been clearly delineated. However, when you talk about not just disrupting command and control, when you talk about ambiguity, creating ambiguity and deception, we, US, absolutely, of course, had the ability to do that very well at the tactical level. Legally, all right, we could probably make, just an argument, we could probably make the argument that Russian units in the Ukraine involved in violation of sovereignty of another nation, therefore legally and without risk of escalation, or we put that out there, we can use cyber against command and control systems of Russian units in the Ukraine. All right, again, that's not an argument against policy. I'm just thinking that maybe looking ahead, these are things that we should be looking at, right? Because that would mean, though, perhaps, there's initial decision, and then in order to be able to really use cyber in the same way that we use kinetic weapons right now, we would need to push the decision level for using cyber at a lower level. And if you guys think this is very far-fetched, these are discussions that are happening now. But we have, within DoD, have some cultural barriers to get through before we decide to do the same thing with information operations, right? And I say this too because as you go into, as you embark on your careers, remember this: the guys who specialize in information operations, who are smart in operations in the information environment, are not the PSYOP dudes, okay? They are you. All of you have to be good at this stuff. That was brought home to me over and over again in the SOF community, and Colonel Homiak will attest to this too, where working the psychological piece becomes almost second nature. And that's, for a while, what, as I mentioned, what we did with the Islamic State. And here again, think about the problem set in Ukraine. All right, not just in the Ukraine, but there's three segments of the Russian population that make ideal targets for an information operations campaign. Number one, Russian soldiers in the Ukraine. All right, initially we were getting, most reports that I read said most of them were, they were full-time soldiers, right? They weren't conscripts. But it appears now that a number of them are conscripts. It doesn't matter. Counterinsurgent, or a war is unpopular, as the one in Ukraine is, right now, against people who speak, the same language as you. I know Ukrainian and Russian are different, but they share a common past. Very, very easy to build on that, right? Messaging. The Ukrainians are already doing it. And the US potentially can put a lot of technical support and assistance behind that. Number two, families of those with relatives in the army in Ukraine. Russian mothers, surprisingly enough, in an autocratic government, an autocratic country, are a significant voting bloc, not voting bloc, but political bloc. If you look at Afghanistan, all right, one of the influence that Russian mother, I forget the name of the organization, but it was an organization of Russian mothers that was instrumental in bringing about withdrawal from Afghanistan. So, you can't poo-poo this information operations stuff, but we've got to be smart at it. How are we doing it? We're not doing this, And the third segment of the Russian population are those around Putin, right? Who are hurt, some of whom by the sanctions, the elite within Russia. We're already getting not just anecdotal reports, but serious papers like The Economist or BBC. Even Al Jazeera came out with a story yesterday about how those around Putin are kind of edging away from him now. And, I'm not oversimplifying it, guys. I'm just saying that, all of this, rather than us moving brigade combat teams into Poland, yes, of course, we need to do that. Yes, of course. But in the end, those are they're just speed bumps, right? But this stuff in the cyber world, the stuff about getting sensors, long-range precision fires, all of this stuff is the face of modern war. And it's stuff that all of you as students, even regardless of MOSs you're going into, students of the military, students of warfare, I hope that you guys are studying, or at least looking at. Okay. By the way, on that point, and this is why I'm a little geeky on this. So one of the things I do since retiring is I go out to 29 Palms in the desert, Mojave Desert. It's garden spot of the world. Those of you who've been there, if you haven't been there, you really don't need to go. It's, it's barren. But the Marine Corps does its live fire training. It does most of its large combined arms maneuver training out there. And the Marine Corps is experimenting out there with peer-on-peer exercises, replicating, let's face it, going against China in Indo-PACOM. And our blue forces there regularly get their asses kicked. And that isn't because the aggressor has home turf advantage, because we rotate the aggressor units there. But the point is that we are just, this is a cultural problem, I think, in the Marine Corps right now. We've got to start thinking in terms of everything that I was been talking about, information, cyber, using them in the same way that we used to use kinetic weapons for suppression, for jamming, for create ambiguity, use of longer range drones, or just even getting to understanding our own drones, understanding the electromagnetic spectrum, all of these things, making greater use of intelligence, signals intelligence in particular. These are the things that what we used to call warriors, I'm talking tactical level combat leaders are having to master. So the line between the knuckle-dragging grunt and the cyber warrior is getting increasingly blurred. I think that's a good thing, personally. So those of you regardless, there's nothing wrong with being a knuckle-dragging grunt. The problem is that, now you have to understand it all. You have to understand information. You have to understand cyber. You have to understand what can be done in the electromagnetic spectrum, and you have to be comfortable with all of that. Colonel Humiak and I had a little bit of an advantage being in the SOF community, learning about these things. But now, now I see the need, very much the case in the Marine Corps. And yet the Marine Corps' rifle squad, its mission, close with and destroy the enemy by fire and maneuver, is the same rifle squad as I served in as a Lance Corporal 34 years ago. No more lethal. No more long-range fires. So you can see we have to make this shift. We really do, because our adversaries are outstripping us. I know that sounds like I'm being Chicken Little, and I know it sounds like here's the old retired dude saying, hey, you guys, good luck out there. There's a lot of stuff you need to fix. But it's important. It's important to understand the playing field right before you come on. Okay, all right, so on I never use notes, but I do use a clock, so you'll be glad to hear. But I do have just a guide here, so I don't get off. It was given to me very kindly, I think, by Colonel Humiak. And number one, it says career. I promise you I'm not going to bore you with the story of my career, but I will give you some highlights or low points that things, when I promise you I'd tell you things that I wish I'd known along the way. So as some of you, some of the more acute members of the audience here may have realized, I am from overseas. I'm actually a first-generation immigrant. I'm from the UK originally. Most of my family is still there. And I was recruited in London. Don't worry, this isn't going to be a blow-by-blow account of my career. But it's kind of an interesting story. So there was a Marine recruiter in London, 1987, because there were US high schools throughout Europe. And I was his quota. I had just graduated law school. I drove a very hard bargain, guaranteed PFC at a boot camp, guaranteed infantry. Yeah, those of you going to be Marines will know that's a joke when I said that. Yeah, that was not a hard bargain at all. I'm sure he's still laughing. And then Parris Island was no kidding, Parris Island was my first introduction to the United States. So you can imagine this country sucks. Everyone yells at you. But I got over it. I always intended to go back and study law, and then time slipped away from me, and 31 years later, I was retiring. But as a lieutenant and a captain, I learned a couple of very, very hard lessons early on, and one of which, first of all, I was talking a little bit about this before over dinner. Way back, early 1991, right? The Gulf War, Hussein. It was 91, right? Anyway, it doesn't matter. I missed the Gulf War totally. I watched it on TV, which you can imagine. We're coming out of infantry officer course. For 8 months by then, we thought we were totally prepared to go to war. This is what we were doing. There was a lot of talk about mass casualties, about use of gas. They said, hey, you guys, we're going to put you in a casualty replacement company in 29 Palms because we expect to take a lot of casualties. And we went to 29 Palms, and we were sitting there in the Warrior Club, and we watched the war end in 100 hours. And it seemed like our lives were over. You can imagine, it seemed like we were the only Marines in the entire Marine Corps who were not combat veterans. So those of you who were in at the time will remember that. Even worse, I got orders for a battalion in Okinawa, the one battalion that had not deployed to Saudi Arabia. And they'd run out of ammunition, training ammunition. Everything had been taken away from them. They'd been sitting in Okinawa on the rock for a year, doing nothing except drinking. So you can imagine their morale was sky high. And lo and behold, 3 brand new second lieutenants get dumped on the battalion. And I'm confronted with a platoon of 40 dudes who the last thing they need is a brand new second lieutenant saying, well, man, I think we need to do some training today. It was it was, yeah, it was a baptism by, it was certainly a baptism by fire. You know, here's one thing, though, that I want you guys to remember. You know, when I talked about self-reflection, I talked about don't paralyze yourself. Bear in mind, all right, when you pin on second lieutenant's bars, when those of you going to the Marine Corps after you finish TBS, or the rest of you you've gone through your MOS schools, and for the first time you find yourself standing in front of soldiers or Marines or airmen or sailors, you are 100% qualified to be where you are and making the decisions that you're going to be called upon to make. I want to remind you of that because, there's a lot of talk about second lieutenant. Marines are Marines. Marines love joking about second lieutenants. But you have all the tools, remember that. Okay, that doesn't mean be an arrogant ass. What it does mean, though, is when it comes down to it, when you have a feeling in your gut, 9 times out of 10, your feeling is right. Doesn't matter what your squad leaders or your guys are telling you. Go with the feeling in your gut. By all means, solicit input. I always said, you know how it is when you're giving an order as a lieutenant, and you always have one or two squad leaders like, what the fuck, man? I don't know what he said. And so one thing I always used to do, and this isn't just a gimmick, this is, you always invite input. Hey, fellas, anyone else got a better idea? I'm all ears, man. We got about 45 seconds to listen to anyone else's idea, all right? And it was a trick I learned early on. I repeated it again and again to include in combat. And it's, sometimes it always works. Sometimes people come up with brilliant ideas, much better than anything you could come up with, and you do not cede your position. Okay, I mention that not because I'm here to tell you leadership gimmicks. That's not a gimmick. My point is, inclusion is all that people want, right? Of course there's going to be an element of resentment because you are an officer, you earn more money, you're in a more privileged position, you have absolute power, it seems, over, enlisted Marines or soldiers. So of course there's going to be resentment. But at the same time, the way to break it down is include them, let them know, remind them. Of course, it's always your decision in the end, and you take responsibility for that decision. But absolutely solicit input. You never, ever weaken your position doing that. Okay. So that was, fortunately, life got better. Don't worry, I'm not reading my emails. I'm checking the time. Because fortunately, life got better. And we deployed to, we came back from Okinawa. We deployed to Mogadishu, Somalia. And it was a very interesting time. Now scenes of combat, Iraq and Afghanistan had become commonplace. But back then it was pretty uncommon. And it was quite a shock certainly for my platoon, to go into a situation where very quickly they were getting shot at, they're carrying live ammo, et cetera, and having to respond. One thing that I noticed there, and it stayed with me in Iraq and Afghanistan, is the very quick slide that can take place into moral oblivion, all right? I know that sounds worse than I made it sound, but what I mean by that is, this really does put the onus on you. When we talk about why we give people a commission in the United States military, this is one of the main reasons. And this is why it really upsets me when I see officers charged with law of armed conflict violations getting pardoned, et cetera. Because one of the hardest things to do as an officer is to lead group of Marine soldiers into an environment like that. Somalia is just an example. Iraq or Afghanistan were the same way, and all the debilitating circumstances and conditions seem to conspire to generate anger and desire for revenge among your guys. And trust me, even the best people are capable of incredibly cruel acts. And the one thing standing often between your unit and those sort of actions is you. I'm not exaggerating. It's 100%. Okay, things start with small things. I don't know if you read. I know it sounds like a bad topic, but actually it's an important topic, because when I say you have an exponential effect to prevent those things, you also have an exponential effect for good as far as the moral imperative. And this isn't me, beating the drum on this. This is a really important part of our profession. I don't know if you guys read about My Lai, the My Lai massacre, or you learn about it here at VMI. I know when I went through the basic school, we had to learn about it. But here's the bottom line. So My Lai, there's no doubt about the facts. 541 Vietnamese villagers killed by US troops from the Americal Division. Girls as young as 10 raped, really just a horrific, if you feel inclined, read the investigation. It's hard reading. Well, the thing is, though, when you look at the background of that platoon, they were actually a really good platoon. They were, and I only know this because someone did the research. Actually, a New York Times correspondent wrote a really good long feature article on this on the anniversary of the massacre. But the platoon had a higher percentage of high school graduates than the average platoon in the U.S. Army back there. By far, highest number of professional correspondence courses. They'd done well during workup training in Hawaii. They'd done well during the first 1 or 2 months in Vietnam. No problems, no disciplinary problems. One thing changed. They brought in a new platoon commander. Their old platoon commander was popular left, and Lieutenant Calley came in. And Lieutenant Calley, as you probably have learned, was a bag of worms. And he started turning a blind eye to his guys slapping villagers around. And as soon as he started turning a blind eye, things started to gather momentum. Women started getting raped, when the patrols would go through villages. He didn't seem to care, and soldiers picked up on that. The more he turned a blind eye, the more things started to escalate. Now, I know those of you who are My Lai purists will point out there's other factors involved. They had a psychopathic company commander too, etc. The odds were stacked against them. But the point is that those guys, and if you ever seen them interviewed on TV now, these aren't serial killers, but they're American soldiers who did horrific things. And the one thing that perhaps could have prevented them doing those horrific things and making My Lai such a black stain on our U.S. military's history was their platoon commander, Lieutenant Calley. You don't have to look at that one case, guys. You can fast forward. Some of you, I know, Colonel Looney or Colonel Homiak may be familiar with the background to the Haditha massacre in Iraq, 2005. They're not necessarily, a squad leader went rogue. In that particular case, battalion commander was actually a friend of mine, was relieved. And this is a really interesting point, actually. I was going through the battalion commander's pre-command course at the time, and General Mattis came to talk to us. And General Mattis, I forget what billet he had at the time. He was no longer a division commander. He might have had the MEF, I can't remember. But anyway, he came to talk to us, and he explained why he had fired the commanding officer of 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines. He said, hey, I know a lot of you guys know him and think highly of him. He was an introvert. And I was thinking, well, that's a reason. Was that a reason to fire him? And General Mattis said, well, the point is that battalion came out of Fallujah, and they were wired for the fight, right? And they got a new battalion commander, and he didn't recognize the culture, what had gone wrong within that battalion. He made no attempt to talk to the Marines. As I said, he was an introvert. And when things started to go wrong, he didn't really drop the hammer to prevent them going downhill. And then eventually you get this incident, which, however way you look at it, 24 Iraqi civilians died who probably did not need to die. And so, General Mattis, say what you like. I mean, about General Mattis, every time he talks, I listen to him because I learned something. And his point was, look, it's okay to be introvert. It's okay. I don't care if you're shy, but you've got to act. You've got to step up to the plate. You have to, because if you don't, someone else will. And someone else will control that culture within your unit. And I thought that was a very interesting thing to say. At the basic school, we were told, hey, just be yourself, right? Be yourself, everything will be fine. But then, as I've learned, leadership is often an act, I think. You have to act sometimes, you have to pretend to be angry when you're not. You have to pretend not to be scared a lot of times when you're very scared. And sometimes you have to pretend, yeah, you've got to pretend to be more vocal, more outgoing than you actually are. And if you think that this story is an anomaly, in General McChrystal's book, My Share of the Task, he says the same thing. He says, hey, I hated the morning meetings at JSOC, where they would do the holiday squares. This is like early days of Zoom, right? It wasn't called Zoom. But every morning, those of you who worked, in or around JSOC will know the morning meetings are a big deal, and they bring in JSOC units from all over the world. And he hated being the center of attention to those things. At the time, 3-star general. It's amazing, isn't it? So my point here is this, okay? Be comfortable with who you are, right? You don't have to be an extrovert. And if you are the sort of guy or girl who doesn't like going to cocktail parties, because you don't like talking to new people and everything, it's fine. It really is. But remember what I've said, okay? Sometimes you have to act. And if you treat it that way, then it actually becomes quite easy. I, believe it or not, am at heart an introvert. My fiance accuses me of lying when I say that, but I am. But just like many of us, we've had to learn. So a lot there, a lot to think about. The exponential, the moral imperative of being a leader. I'm not talking about religion or anything. I'm talking about just the moral imperative. Never think, sadly, that story about letting incremental things go doesn't just apply to war crimes. It applies, too, to a lot of the problems we're having in the special operations community right now. One of the culminating points for the SEAL community, of course, there was the case of Chief Petty Officer Gallagher, but one of the culminating incidents, and I know this because I happened to be with NSW at the time, was when they had a whole platoon sent back from Iraq for drinking, all right? And what had happened is it actually had come to people's attention because there was an allegation of sexual assault. Well, when you pull the string, the drinking had been going on for a long time, and it was universal, it was ubiquitous. And the way it was justified within the community was, hey, these dudes do all this good stuff, they need to blow off a little bit of steam. But you see what I'm saying? Blowing off a little steam never stops there. I know I'm sounding like probably an old fogey. On this point, though, it gets back to what I was saying earlier. Trust your gut, and things don't seem right. Absolutely address it. And don't think ever it's okay, even for a relatively small thing. Because when you make excuses for your guys, hey, he's tired, this and that, you're really not helping them. One more example, and then I'll get off this kind of downer topic. During the opening days of Iraqi, whatever we're calling it, Iraqi freedom, right, 2003, the opening months, 1st Marine, I just finished rereading 1st Marine Division, kind of history about it. Again, I told you I'm a sad individual. I was bored. No. But I was intrigued. I was writing something, so I went back to read it. And, General Mattis, again, made a point. He said, hey, we're killing Iraqis every day on checkpoints throughout the city. He was talking about in Baghdad, innocent Iraqis. We're going to start an insurgency soon if we don't get a handle on this. And it wasn't psychopaths doing this. It was kids. It was 18, 19, 20-year-old Marines who really thought their lives were in danger and that they were at roadblock checkpoint. But when you break down the risk, it was minuscule. Bing West estimates, I don't know how he did this math, but maybe 1 in 1 in 10,000 cars was a VBIED carrying a bomb, and yet we were, our guys were shooting regularly at cars and killing families and people in them. And it was you know what, though, as we started pulling a string on this, I was with 7th Marines at the time, it came down to leadership. It came down to battalion commanders saying, hey, man, if you think your life's in danger, go to it, pull the trigger. And I realized, looking back, that was moral cowardice, too. Yeah, of course you have a right to defend yourself, but you also have an obligation not to kill innocent people. So you've got to, and you're a United States Marine or soldier, that means you're going to put your life sometimes at risk to, maybe for a second or two more to verify that what you're shooting needs to be shot. But commanders just didn't want to tell their people that. And the sad part of this is this, all right? And this is why perhaps this is an important topic to me. It is for a number of reasons, but the sad part is this. Psychological injury, moral injury, is every bit as impactful as psychological injury or physical injury. And I've experienced it, not myself, but I've come across many Marines who are struggling with things that they did when they're 18, 19, 20. But if you pull the string on it, they did it because they had leadership that was weak. I know that sounds like I'm being unforgiving, but I think it's quite right to be unforgiving on these things because a lot of guys are paying the price now. So please, that's a lot of stuff to throw at you guys. It's all stuff that it took me a while to think through, but please, bear it in mind. The last thing I'm going to say, and I'm going to warn you, it's really difficult. It's really difficult to make a stand about something when you have every sympathy for the people that you are being hard on. It was difficult when I was a series commander and company commander on the drill field, where your tendency is to feel sympathy, empathy for the drill instructors because they are Marines like you, they're staff NCOs, they've proven themselves rather than recruits. It's tempting to to feel that way about your own guys in a place like Iraq or Afghanistan where the local population is from a completely different culture, behaves differently, and they seem like outsiders, right? They almost seem, to your guys, they seem hostile. They seem, even when they're not. So you've got to be very keyed into that and prevent that rift, that gulf, the us and them thing from coming up. And to do that means separating yourself from your own kind of, your own comfort zone, right? I don't know if I explained that well, but that when I think about the strength of character it takes to be an officer, I think about those things. I really do. Yes, moral courage too. Moral courage is arguably something that among all the leadership traits, I would say probably least in, I'm trying to word this right, in shortest supply. We generally in the military, we don't have any problem with physical courage. It's easy, it's relatively easy to do what you need to do, right? Even if there are bullets firing around because you've been trained to do it. And if you're in a position of responsibility, it kind of gets your mind off the fact that your life might be in danger. It's not, it's not that. It's not like the type of courage you need to face a lifelong illness or the death of a loved one. It's kind of adrenaline-infused courage. That's easy. But the courage, the cold courage, the moral courage is the part that's really difficult. And that, we're all brought up wanting to be popular. It's part of our culture. I grew up in the UK, you grew up here, it's the same thing. Western culture pushes us to be popular. That doesn't mean you can be an ass. But at least know that about yourself, be wary of it, and be prepared that that's probably going to be your biggest test. It may well be your biggest test. Okay. Did you start me for time-wise at 7:55, right? So I got about 10 more minutes. He's nodding. I'm nodding for you. Yeah, okay, absolutely. So I'm gonna jump ahead and talk about something else that it's kind of linked, all right? But it's leading up, all right? Descent. I'm going to phrase this more as leading up. When I was a lieutenant, a nascent lieutenant going through OCS, TBS, an infantry officer course, and before that as a corporal, I learned a ton about leading down. You know, in the Marine Corps, we even teach leadership like everything by acronym, right? JJ, did, tie, buckle, and I can't even remember what that stands for. I think justice, you know, I can't even remember what the second J stands for, which tells you how deeply inured that became with me. But anyway, the point is, yeah, so I learned a lot about leading, but nothing about leading up, right? And so when I think back to my peers as we went out and joined battalions, this is the 90s, it's a very different time. It was before they used to spend a lot of time, before the Marine Corps spent a lot of time selecting battalion commanders. So my point is that not all battalion commanders out there were good leaders. And a lot of us found us, even at company level, working for guys whose leadership skills seemed like they were picked up from Genghis Khan. And so invariably what our response was simply knuckle down. You know, and I remember that continued, you know, when I was an operations officer in a battalion. I had two, you're probably going to think I'm the problem, maybe I am, but I had two battalion commanders in a row who were just screaming maniacs. I mean, they were, you know, they were good guys and Marine officers, blah, 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 but they were, you know, volatile. They violated everything that we learn about good leadership, right? You know, public humiliation, all these other things were tools for them. And by then I was a major. And, you know, I totally failed in trying to shape either battalion commander. Our only recourse was simply, hey, we can wait this dude out. And I remember making everyone read The Caine Mutiny. By the way, who here has read The Caine Mutiny? Oh, shame on you all. Okay, you need to go and buy The Caine. No, actually buy my book before The Caine Mutiny. It's better. Anyway, so The Caine Mutiny, I won't go into it, but it's about, basically, as you can tell, it's about this tyrannical skipper of a minesweeper, and the crew gets so pissed off, they stage a mutiny, and then they get court-martialed, right? So I'm not ruining the story for you. But anyway, kind of the theme of the story is, hey, you need to shut up and just do it, right? Because the service has selected this guy. There's a reason why he selected this guy. Just be loyal. But that was unsatisfactory to me, that answer, because these guys were also hurting the institution. And the higher they got in rank, the greater influence they had over more people they made miserable. And so it was not serving the institution by simply not trying to shape them. Now, why am I telling you guys that? You're going to be second lieutenant. I'm not suggesting you go in and start chewing out your battalion commanders when you check into a unit. And, you know, hey, boss, there's a couple of things I noticed just on your first day here that you might want to work on. Not a good technique. But what I am saying is be prepared for that, okay? Typically, you know, and it doesn't have to be with a bad leader. All of us working for a boss, this goes for you in civilian life too, must become adept at shaping your boss. It doesn't mean manipulating. It means playing to their strengths, building their strengths, trying to mitigate their weaknesses, being absolutely honest with them, all right? All of these things are very important, and they're very difficult. Don't ever hide simply behind the guise of straightforward obedience, because you have an obligation to your subordinates too. Do not forget that. When you take that oath, you know, I know it's such a cliche to say we take an oath to the Constitution. Well, you do, yeah, absolutely. And by the way, when you ask people to define exactly what that means in practice, they find it very difficult. You know, so think through what that means. And I can tell you, to me at least, there's an implicit obligation to your subordinates too, all right? We're an all-volunteer force. Even if we weren't an all-volunteer force, you do. You have power of life and death over them, all right? They swear to obey you. You don't swear to obey anyone in your oath, by the way, as an officer. They swear to obey those above them. That puts a tremendous obligation on you to make sure that they aren't wasting their lives or doing really ridiculous things. Now, does that mean you make a stand every time your guys are told to paint rocks? No. You know, some of this is that's just being in the military, all right? But bear in mind, okay, it's an important lesson. And those who don't think it is aren't really reading the news, you know, aren't looking at things that are happening in the world. and I just very quickly, and then I'll turn over to, to questions. 2017, there were a series of collisions, well, two serious collisions in the Pacific, all right? Now, involving the John McCain, and I think it was the Stennis, 17 sailors killed. When you pull the string on that, and I read the investigation, I read there was a great article in Politico. When you read through all of that stuff, what emerges is this. Seventh Fleet was a bag of worms. They had all kinds of systemic problems going on within the fleet. But in the end, in the final analysis, two skippers chose to go to sea when their ships were not ready. Their crews were not ready. Their ships were not ready. Not the equipment, the training. They should have known it. They did know it. They were prompted to go to sea because they were ordered to. For what? For an exercise. You see what I'm saying? So they forgot about their obligation to subordinates. Just one example. Would it have been wrong for them to say, hey, boss, I'm not putting to sea, man, for an exercise. Here's why. Maybe they'd have got relieved, maybe not, but far better than that than 17 dead sailors. So you may think that's an extreme example. You will come across examples right off the bat in your career where you're asking yourself, hey, should I challenge this? Hey, this doesn't seem like it makes sense. Continue to nurture that in you because we need to be critical thinkers. We've got too many guys right now in the military, and I love the military. I'm very proud to have served in it, but too many guys who are not critical thinkers and simply kind of buckle down and do what they're told. All right, am I at the point where I should be turning over to questions? Okay, super. See, that's a high threshold for moral courage. Well done. Well done, that man. Now watch, he's just going to go to the restroom.
I got to go.
I called it.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening. Oh,
over here.
What's that?
To your left here, sir. Yeah. Right here.
Okay. All right. Sorry. Yeah, I was like, man, he's throwing his voice. Beautiful.
First, I just want to say thank you for coming out tonight and speaking to all of us. My name is Cadet Duffy. I'm a first-classman here.
You look vaguely familiar.
Yeah, we spoke at dinner. I wanted to touch on the point that you mentioned early on when you were speaking about the increasing importance in which we're placing cyber warfare, or that it's emerging in the 21st century. And I read an article about a week or two ago about Lieutenant General, I believe his last name is pronounced Heichel, who's a Marine Corps aviator, remarked how, if people are thinking that we're catching up with China, they're insane. And one of the issues that I talked about was by directly commissioning people into the Marine Corps as just cyber officers and just circumventing the process of OCS or TBS and any of that and just implementing them as cyber officers because they're simply the best at that job. And I want to get your...
What blasphemy.
Yeah. I want to get your thoughts on that.
That's a really, that's a great point. I'm pausing because I don't think I have a conclusive answer to you. I mean, there's the Marine in me that is just shocked, bereft, speechless, verklempt at the thought of a Marine bypassing what makes us Marines, right? I think we can do both. I mean, there's plenty of, we have plenty of guys who are perfectly, physically fit enough to get, I mean, the Marine, those of you who've been through OCS, it's not, it's not as though our bar is so high. But I don't think we have to do that. I think it would be a shame to do that. It's not because I'm an old fogey. I just simply don't think that we need to. I understand that we need to attract that kind of talent, but if the Marine Corps can't, then the Air Force and Army certainly can. But I really do. I know. I mean, my point is that my concern is that we develop this group of dudes, Marvel Cyber, whatever, who are just brilliant at what they do, but we still don't have mainstream MAGTF officers who understand what cyber can do, right? So I would rather than focus on building specialists, especially as officers, I would rather that we taught all of our guys what cyber can do. We have a few who can do it really well. I mean, I bet you, and I'll shut up in a moment, but so I found out today that Marine Corps takes entry-level cyber officers in, right? Yeah, we both found out. We found out together.
Yes, sir.
It was a journey, anyway, which is great. But I think also we should offer that as a career-enhancing tour. We should make it worthwhile for officers who, say, did a tour in the infantry or somewhere else. Hey, do you want to be a cyber officer? Maybe better prospects at promotion, maybe better prospects at command. I mean, we can create incentives within the organization without dropping standards. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
Did that answer your question?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Yeah, you're right, though. I mean, we're never going to achieve dominance against Chinese. I think we're looking for parity, right? We're looking for mutually assured paralysis in the cyber world. That's what we want to threaten our enemies with.
Thanks, sir.
Thanks, great question. No, I didn't plant that during dinner.
Hey, thanks so much, sir, for coming in. To talk to your idea of moral courage, how would we strive to impact our subordinates to have that moral courage under just these ideas of, okay, we're in the military and we do the right thing? How do we reach a higher aspect of morality other than, hey, this is what the standard says?
Yeah, I think I don't have a silver bullet answer. I just think that we need to when we talk about when we teach leadership at our schools, typically we don't do it in a very imaginative way. I think that we need to have more, we need to still inculcate leadership all the way through our professional military education, but we need to do it in a more Socratic method, discussions. And I think that's, doing case studies or having just people, I run a leadership course at SOCOM for all the junior officers who come through SOCOM. I made myself sound too grandiose. I help run the course. But the point is, for most of that course, we have them talking about different topics, and they're learning from each other's experiences. And moral courage comes up a lot in that. Really tough calls, and guys are totally honest. Oh yeah, I really punted this one in the stands. I feel like, it was chicken shit. I backed down. So I don't think, I think that's probably the approach. There's a couple of other things real quick. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to keep you standing up there. But so the second point is we need to look at how we do talent management. I think that for our performance evaluation, I think our performance evaluation should be 360 degrees, which means subordinates and peers report on you. Now, that's a controversial topic because people argue, hey, I've heard many Marines say, and I understand why they're saying it, many Marine officers say, hey, I don't want a dude who's pandering to his subordinates, right?
Yes, sir.
But the bottom line is, again, Marines and soldiers aren't dumb. They don't want an officer who panders to them. I think, you'd find, and you're not going to throw it out to every lance corporal, it would be, subordinate leaders. And I think you'd find a pretty fair system. And peers, certainly. Peers are great judges of character. You guys know that, right? Or maybe not. So I don't know if any of you are getting peered out. But, but also talent management coming in. I'm very glad all of you guys are getting commissioned. But think, and you went through VMI, okay? So that's good. At least someone was looking at you for 4 years. But most officers we have coming in, not just the Marine Corps, have gone through kind of a paper selection process. Correct me if I'm wrong, Travis, but they go to an OSO. Maybe they've gone through NROTC. But by contrast, the Canadians, the Australians, and the Brits, no, I'm very glad I'm here. I'm glad I'm not in the British Army. But the point is that they do a three-day board if you want to be an officer, regardless of background. You've got to get everything that you do you know, your scores and everything gets you to go to that board. And then in the board, they'll throw things at you where you're going to fail, right? And so they're judging you at your worst moments.
Yes.
Leadership reaction courses, things like this. So you're going through practical tests, the tests that they give them at MARSOC, you know, all those psychological tests, emotional intelligence. We don't do that. I'm thinking, why not? You know, that really helps. That doesn't, you're talking specifically about moral courage, but my point is, all of these things contribute to someone who is willing then to build his moral courage and work on it. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
Over lengthy answer.
Hey, thanks so much, sir.
Anyone else? It's kind of, I know it's kind of like, it seems like an intimidating walk, right, to come down to talk to the microphone. If you'd rather stand up and volley a question at me, by all means. Or if you simply want to go to the restroom, by all means, go ahead.
Sir, over here. So earlier in your speech, you talked about staying in mental shape. I was wondering what that looked like for you and what that should look like for a future second lieutenant.
Yeah, for me it was reading. But I didn't. I wasn't always good at this until, as a captain, a guy named General Van Riper, some of you may have heard, came and spoke to us when I was going through the amphibious warfare school, and he brought out that analogy, you know, and he said, hey, everyone, as you progress in your career, no one's going to depend. If we're depending on you, on your ability, on your physical fitness, or your ability to shoot for your guys to stay alive, we're screwed. Okay, we're going to depend on your intellect. We're going to depend on your leadership skills, and the only way you improve those is through experience and reading, which is experience by proxy, right? And I can't tell you how much of the difference I think that made for me. I've always enjoyed reading, but it's hard, right? Because you've got so much to get through in a day, and it just seems like you're sitting there with a book, and it's like, I could be on the phone, I could be. But trust me, if you set aside time, you've got to carve out time to do that. And then, you know, select carefully what you're going to read. Reading or just taking notes. I know it sounds geeky. I kept a journal during my tours in Iraq, and it really helped me. I mean, it really did. It helped for a number of reasons. It helped sort out my thoughts in the evening, being able to write down things that had happened, what I'd learned. Yeah, so much happens that you think you're going to remember. That's the trick of the human mind. Yeah, I'll remember that, but you never do unless you write it down or you reflect on it. Great question.
Time for one more question. Sir.
Sir, you mentioned earlier in your talk, you were discussing that by the time you become second lieutenant, you're 100% qualified, which says inclusion is generally what people are searching for. You also said that resentment is, to some extent, completely natural when you're in that position, especially as a relatively young person in that position. But I'm sure you'd also agree when I say like feedback from your subordinates and your peers is helpful and necessary. So where do you kind of find that line between genuine feedback from your subordinates and peers and perhaps some of the more inevitable ground you've been laying right?
That's really tough. Yeah, it is really tough. All I can say is that you kind of get you get a feel for it. All right. A certain night, you're going to hear grumbling. You are going to, whether you're going, it doesn't matter, you're a Marine or a soldier, you're going to hear it, and a lot of it is intended for you to overhear, right? And so there's always that, okay, do I signal knucklehead that I just heard what he said and get pissy at him, or not? And that, you know, that is something that's something that you've got to strike a balance. You often let people know that you picked up on something without getting upset. That if you can remember that, and I've got a quick temper. Well, not quick temper. That's not fair to myself. But yeah, I mean, I get irritable, but I've learned hard. I haven't always learned, But, you know, there are times where bottom line is you've always got to pretend not to let it ruffle you. Unless, and here's what I said about acting, okay? Then trust me, this isn't like, you know, I'm not trying to tell you, hey, this is the book according to Milburn. Sometimes I've had to act angry when I'm not that angry, right? You want to make a point because it's something really dumb, but everyone's been doing it, but you want to make a point. So again, I know it's not a complete, I can't give you a if this, then that, but I can tell you, if you go back to what I said earlier, sometimes you've got to understand you're putting on an act, all right? I know you guys who quote me are going to say, that sounds crazy, but you are. It is. It's all the best purposes. It's not to make yourself look good. It's just that's in order to make the unit function and people respond the way they need to respond. Sometimes you have to pretend to be not quite the person, not quite as patient as you are, not quite as brave as you are, right? Whatever it may be. Hopefully that answered your question.
Okay,
No,
great.
we'd have been totally messed up if he'd said not at all.
Yeah. Is that good? Well, Colonel Milburn, I want to thank you for coming. Great comments, shows a lot of combat savvy and a lot of leadership savvy that you shared with our audience. So thank you very much. So on behalf of the superintendent, the Corps of Cadets, and the staff and faculty, thanks for being our second Courageous Leader this year.
Well, thank you so much.
We appreciate sharing your thoughts.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Let's give him a round.
Thank you.